Hey, folks. So, the second story I have for you today is actually it's a couple stories that took place when I was down in Australia. Now, to give you the background of my Australian tour, I was stationed at Randolph in 1978, 79, and 80, early 80, and used to call up a high school classmate of mine, Doc Holliday, and we would meet for lunch on occasion and chit chat about this, that, and the other. Well, right after we both came out on the majors list, I called him up for lunch, and we met over at the cafeteria. And we both were on the majors list. I told him, I said, "Well, Bill, I'm not sure what I'm going to do on my next assignment." I'd been at Randolph at that time for about a little over a year, perhaps, at headquarters ATC flight safety, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do or where I was going to go. So Bill said, "Why don't you have you ever considered an exchange tour?" Well, as a major, I thought I was a little bit out of the age bracket for it, that I'd aged out. And he says, "No," he said, "they've got majors, lieutenant colonels, they got a smattering of everybody." So he put me on to this fellow named Mel Dumpke over at MPC. Now, Mel, as it turns out, had a little closet. I think it used to be well, it was a closet, I think, at one time in MPC to walk in, and it wasn't very wide, maybe 6, 8 feet wide, perhaps, and kind of long, and his desk was at the end. So I go walking in there. I think Bill might have tagged along and got to talking with Mel, and I said, I might be interested in an exchange tour. And he said, "Well," he says, "what do you do?" Now, I've got this flight suit on. And I said, "Well, I just happen to be a pilot. And also," I said, "flight safety officer." He says, "Well, we have a flight safety officer's job opening up in Australia." And I said, "Great, I'll take that one. Thank you very much." He says, "No, you have to apply for it." Well, okay then. Now, as I might have mentioned earlier, one of the things I have always been very good at is reading the background on things. And so I dug out the manual on the actual prerequisites, the requirements, and so forth. And what they wanted a fighter pilot to kind of oversee the flight safety of their fighter force. But what they put in that description was fighter, attack, reconnaissance, high performance. Well, I took Mel outside and pointed him at the T-38, and I said, "There's your high performance." He agreed. So we submitted my application, and I suppose the statute of limitations has come and gone since 1979. As it turns out, there was this Group Captain Stevenson. God, I'll think of his name here in a minute, first name. Anyway, he was an exchange officer as a group captain, which is a full colonel, and he worked with my mom, and I had met him. So I'd gone over to Mom's house once I put my application in, and we called. He was now an Air Vice Marshal, two-star general in the Australian Air Force. So we called him up and said, "Hey," Jeffrey, I think was his name. So we called him up and said, "Hey, I can't remember, Air Vice Marshal Stevenson." I said, "I've just applied for the position of safety officer down in Canberra. Just thought you might want to know, might be interested." He said, "Oh, great." He said, "I'll go over and talk to the embassy folks in the morning." Well, as it turns out, the next morning, true to his word, he went over to the embassy and told the ambassador, "Bob Holliker just applied for the position. He's the one that we want. I know him personally." And the rest was history. So I got the assignment. When I got down there and the Aussies found out that I did not have the fighter experience that they were perhaps seeking, they were in a quandary. They didn't want to embarrass the Americans and say, "Oh, you sent us the wrong guy." But on the other hand, they wanted to make sure they tied up that loophole. So I helped them tie it up. Anyway, when I was in flight safety down there, I had a ball with those guys. I mean, they were so welcoming, and I just loved working with them, and I loved sharing stories with them. So what I have for you after this wandering introductions, a couple stories. Now, the first one involves, I think his name was Dick Strudwick, and he was another command guy working at the headquarters, a couple floors down from where I worked, and down the hallway a bit. And he was working on a new training aircraft for the Australian Air Force and Navy. They wanted to build an aircraft totally from Australian industry. And you think our bureaucracy is a mess. Holy crap, the Australian bureaucracy is a real pain. But anyway, so Dick was a fighter pilot, and he had no love for doing this shoe clerk work. And, well, he hated it. At any rate, he took the task to heart and did the best he could with it. And they got the design after about 2 years. They got the design pretty well solidified, and they needed a name for it. Well, Dick offered this Aboriginal name. I can't remember what it was. I don't think I could pronounce it anyway. So he offered this Aboriginal name. And when he was in the design board, they asked him what it meant, and he said, Soaring Eagle. He was betting on the fact that nobody in the meeting could have spoken Aboriginal. And what it really meant was lame duck. But anyway, we chuckled about that one for 6 months or so, because that's the one that they bought it and went forward with it. Anyway, the next story I picked up on was a story of two guys that had been stationed at RAF Base Butterworth. Now, Butterworth is on the west coast of Malaysia, and it's been an Australian, like a security of forces base for years. And one night they had these two guys. I don't know exactly who they were. One might have been a pilot and the other a flight surgeon, or two pilots, I don't know. Anyway, they had gone over to Penang. They had taken a ferry and gone over to Penang. Penang is an island that sits about a mile off the coast. It's a fairly large-sized island if you care to look it up. And at one time it was a jewel in the British Empire. On the west coast of Penang, they have these British mansions there were just something to behold. I'd gone to Malaysia and Singapore once on a 3-week TDY and happened to be billeted out on Penang, and it was just gorgeous. Anyway, I diverse. So these two guys go over to Penang and they go bar hopping for the night, and when it comes time to catch the ferry back to the mainland, the ferry captain was in the process of closing up shop. They had shut everything down. The last ferry had left, and this little Chinese guy was in the process of cleaning everything up. Well, they went on board the ship and walked up to the wheelhouse there and asked him if they'd give him a ride over to the mainland. And he said, no, we're closed. So they tried to barter with him and everything else to no avail. So finally they looked at each other, they grabbed this little Chinese captain, and they threw his butt off the boat into the water, untied it, fired it up, backed it up. Now instead of going right across the water there, they drove up the coast for a mile or two. RAF Base Butterworth wasn't that far north from the island, maybe a mile or two. So they drove this ferry. And then when they got there were no docks there, but that's not a problem. They just turned and put it on the beach. Crawled off the ferry and went back to the BOQ, the Bachelor Officer Quarters, went to bed. Well, the next morning, it didn't take long before somebody at sunrise discovered this ferry up on the beach. And they began looking into it. And when they finally discovered who the two guys were and what they had done, holy crap, those guys are going to be in a Malaysian prison for the rest of their lives or whatever. So they put them in the back seat of a couple Mirages and took them down to Singapore and let them go. I'm sure they went from there on down to Australia. But they got them out of there pretty darn quick. That one cracked me up. The vision of these two guys just tossing a little Chinese guy off the boat. Holy crap. Anyway, the second story I have, or third story I have for you here. We're sitting around one morning having coffee, and one of the things these Aussie guys had was a great appreciation of history, and they love sharing these stories. I can't remember who it was that told this one, but he told the story of a young Frenchman that had grown up in Alsace-Lorraine in that area just before World War One. And then when World War One came, he watched the Germans come through his parents' vineyards, and then he watched the French come through, pushing the Germans out, and then the Germans came back through, pushing the French out again, and then the British came through with vineyards, and then the Germans came back through, and then the Americans came through and just tore the crap out of the land. Well, he was about 16, 17, 18 at the time, and he vowed to himself that he was going to move somewhere where the prospect of war would be minimal for the rest of his life. And he kind of dedicated himself to that proposition and studied the world, eventually got married, began a family, and then sometime in the early 30s maybe, he took his young family out to the South Pacific and began a coconut plantation on Guadalcanal. Who knew? Guadalcanal. So you imagine all these Marines that hit the beach on Guadalcanal only to run into this French guy going, mon Dieu, mon Dieu. Some things like this, and they say God doesn't have a sense of humor. And as I'm telling this story, it just dawned on me, the Marines. So this is a bonus story for you. 1981, they had an exercise in Australia called Kangaroo 81, K81. The players were the United States Air Force, the Kiwis, the New Zealanders, and the Aussies. The Air Force sent down a contingent of F-15As from Kadena and also some Marines. Now the Marines were going to practice an assault landing with their assault vehicles. So on that day, they all offload to their assault boats off the ships, and they're out there in kind of a holding pattern, just sitting there getting ready to hit the beach. So they get all these guys in these landing craft, and I don't know, they probably had a dozen landing craft or so. And when the time comes, they all get line abreast and they head for the beach. Well, when they hit the beach, they all drive up on the beach, and at a given signal, they all make a right-hand turn. They're in line now, and they drive down the beach to where the Aussies had set up customs, of all things. So these guys, yeah, they got a war going on. They're going to attack whoever's out there, the defenders, but now they got to go through customs. So they drive these damn things through customs, and Aussies have high-pressure hoses to spray the bottom of the landing craft just in case there's any critters there, and they have disinfectant. Once they go through the customs and decontamination area, then they turn around, single file back to where they were when they landed, make another right turn, line abreast, give them a signal, and then they go ahead and attack. So just a couple stories from Australia this morning. I'll probably add a few more here as time goes on. Good to see everybody here, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks.